The doorbell rang twice, fast, the way it does when someone wants you to know they're impatient, and when I opened it, there were two police officers standing on my porch with their hands loose at their sides, and my 17-year-old son, Caleb, standing behind them, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. It was 6:40 in the evening on Father's Day. I still had barbecue sauce on my fingers from the ribs I'd been slow cooking since noon, the ones Caleb used to beg me to make every June, back when he was young enough to sit on the counter and steal pieces of meat before dinner was ready. The taller officer asked if he could come in and talk. The shorter one kept one hand near his belt, not on anything, just near it, the posture they must teach you at the academy for calls that could go sideways. I said, of course, come in, and stepped back, and my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. They said there had been a report of a physical altercation. They said the caller, a minor, stated his father had grabbed him by the throat and shoved him into a wall. They asked if I would step outside while they spoke to my son alone. I said yes, because I had nothing to hide and because some old instinct in me, some voice that had survived 4 years of family court and mediation rooms and a divorce that had taught me more about patience than I ever wanted to learn, told me that fighting this in the doorway would only make it worse. I stood on my own front lawn in my socks in the fading gold light of a Sunday evening, listening to the murmur of voices through a cracked window, waiting to find out whether my son actually believed I had put my hands on him or whether something else was going on that I hadn't seen yet. Because the truth was, I hadn't touched him. I hadn't touched him in anger a single day in his life. And I was about to spend the next several months proving it, not through shouting, not through revenge in the way people usually mean that word, but through patience, paperwork, and the kind of quiet, methodical unraveling that comes from finally understanding exactly who had been standing behind my son the whole time, whispering in his ear. To understand how we got to that porch, you have to go back 3 years, to the day my ex-wife Renata told me she was engaged to a man named Grant Ashford. I want to be fair to Renata because fairness is something I promised myself I would hold on to no matter how ugly things got. And for most of our marriage, she was not a cruel person, just a tired one, worn down by 2 jobs and a husband who worked too many hours running his own contracting business, trying to build something that would outlast both of us. We divorced when Caleb was 14, and it was not dramatic, not full of screaming matches or thrown plates. It was quiet and sad, the kind of ending that comes from 2 people who simply stopped reaching for each other 1 year at a time until there was nothing left to hold. We split custody 50-50. I kept the house. She moved 20 minutes away into an apartment complex with a pool Caleb liked. For the first year, things were almost gentle between us, 2 exhausted parents trying to protect a kid from the wreckage of something neither of us fully understood. Then Grant came along. Grant Ashford sold high-end home security systems, the kind installed in gated communities and lake houses, and he had the sort of easy charisma that made people trust him within the first 5 minutes of a conversation, which in hindsight should have been the first warning sign, because genuine trustworthiness rarely needs to announce itself that fast. He was smooth with Renata, generous with gifts, quick to laugh at things that weren't especially funny, and from the very beginning he treated me not as his fiance's ex-husband, but as an obstacle standing between him and a complete family. I didn't see it clearly at first. I told myself I was being paranoid, that plenty of stepfathers feel threatened by a biological father who's still actively present, and that some friction was natural. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for longer than I probably should have, mostly because Caleb seemed to like him at first, and I wanted my son to have more people in his life who cared about him, not fewer. The shift was slow, which is exactly how these things work when someone is good at what they do. It started with small comments dropped into weekend pickups. Grant would mention, almost offhandedly, that Caleb seemed stressed lately, that maybe it was hard on him bouncing between 2 houses, that some studies showed kids did better with more stability. He never said anything overtly against me. He was too careful for that. He planted seeds and let them grow on their own schedule. He started showing up to Caleb's baseball games, sitting 1 row behind me, engaging Caleb in enthusiastic conversation about college scholarships and travel league opportunities that conveniently required more of Caleb's time on Renata's custody weeks. He bought Caleb a truck for his 16th birthday, a brand new one, when I had been saving for 2 years to help Caleb buy a reliable used sedan, and when Caleb thanked him with the kind of open, grateful joy that only a 16-year-old can produce, I watched something shift in my son's eyes that I didn't like, a recalibration of whose approval mattered more. I want to be honest about something because false modesty has no place in a story like this. I am not a rich man. I run a contracting business, Reyes Restoration, that specializes in fire and water damage repair, and while it's steady and respectable work, it does not compete with a security system salesman who, I would later learn, was making considerably more money than his lifestyle should have accounted for. I couldn't outspend Grant, and for a long time I made the mistake of thinking that was the whole battle, that this was simply a competition for Caleb's affection that I was destined to lose, because I couldn't buy trucks and ski trips and the newest gaming systems. It took me longer than I'm proud of to realize that the real battle wasn't about money at all. It was about narrative. Grant was rewriting the story of our family in Caleb's head, one conversation at a time, and I was too busy working 60-hour weeks trying to keep my business afloat to notice how effectively he was doing it. The turning point, the first real crack I noticed, came about a year before that Father's Day, when Caleb started canceling our regular Wednesday dinners. Not occasionally, the way teenagers do when friends invite them somewhere last minute, but consistently, week after week, always with a vague excuse that felt rehearsed. When I did see him, he was distant in a way that felt engineered rather than organic. The kind of coldness a person adopts when they've been told a story about you that you haven't been given the chance to refute. I started asking him directly what was going on, and he'd shrug and say nothing was wrong, which is what kids say when something is very wrong, but they've been convinced that telling you would be a betrayal of someone else. I made the decision then to document everything, not out of some cynical anticipation of legal warfare, but out of the practical instinct of a man who had already been through one custody negotiation and understood that memory fades and perception gets rewritten unless you keep a record. I started keeping a private journal, dated entries, noting missed dinners, strange comments Caleb made, anything that felt like it had Grant's fingerprints on it. I photographed text exchanges. I saved voicemails. At the time, I told myself I was probably overreacting. I kept the habit anyway. 6 months before Father's Day, my father died. His name was Arturo Reyes, and he had built Reyes Restoration from nothing, starting with a single truck and a shop vac in 1979. And he left the business to me, along with a modest but meaningful piece of real estate, a small commercial lot downtown that he'd bought decades earlier when the neighborhood was nothing and was now worth considerably more than he ever imagined, sitting as it did 2 blocks from a new stadium development. At the funeral, Grant approached me with what looked like genuine sympathy, put a hand on my shoulder, and said something about how family businesses can be such a burden, how sometimes it's healthier to sell and simplify, how he had connections in commercial real estate if I ever wanted an honest appraisal. I thanked him and said I had no plans to sell anything my father built, and I noticed, in a way I couldn't quite name yet, a flicker of something behind his eyes that wasn't disappointment exactly. It was recalibration, the same look I'd seen in Caleb's eyes over the truck. I didn't understand the full shape of what Grant wanted until almost 4 months later, when Caleb, during one of our increasingly rare dinners, mentioned offhandedly that Grant had asked him what he thought his dad's inheritance was worth, and whether he thought I would ever consider cashing out and putting some of it toward Caleb's college fund. It was said so casually, so much like idle dinner conversation, that Caleb clearly hadn't registered it as strange. But I registered it. I sat with that sentence for days. Why would Grant be asking my 17-year-old son to speculate about the value of property he had no legal claim to, unless he was testing the waters, building a case in Caleb's mind that his father was hoarding resources that should rightfully be shared? It was the first moment I understood, with real clarity, that this wasn't about Grant wanting to be a good stepfather competing for affection. It was about access. Access to influence, access to Caleb, and through Caleb potentially some future claim or leverage over what my father had spent 40 years building. I called my attorney, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had handled my divorce and who I'd kept on retainer more out of habit than necessity, and I told her everything: the trucks, the canceled dinners, the comment about the inheritance, the slow campaign of alienation I'd been documenting for over a year. She didn't dismiss it the way I half expected her to. She told me that what I was describing had a name in family law circles, parental alienation, and that documented patterns of it could matter enormously if things escalated, which she warned me they very well might, because men like the one I was describing rarely stop at planting seeds. They tend to need a crisis, a dramatic event that forces a resolution in their favor. She told me to keep documenting, to never raise my voice with Caleb, no matter how frustrated I got, to never confront Grant directly without witnesses or written record, and to start quietly gathering whatever information I could about Grant's actual financial situation, because men who obsess over other people's money are frequently hiding something about their own. That last piece of advice turned out to matter more than either of us expected. I have an old friend from high school, Marcus Webb, who works in commercial insurance fraud investigation, the unglamorous but sharp-eyed profession of figuring out when claims don't add up. Over beers one night, not framing it as an official favor, just 2 old friends talking, I mentioned Grant's name and his company, Ashford Secure Systems, and Marcus went quiet in the specific way people go quiet when a name rings a bell they can't quite place. A week later, he called me and said, off the record, strictly as a friend, that Ashford Secure Systems had been the subject of 2 prior complaints filed with the state licensing board, both eventually withdrawn, both alleging that Grant had billed clients for security equipment and monitoring services that were never actually installed or activated, essentially collecting monthly fees for protection that didn't exist. Both cases had quietly disappeared, likely settled privately, which is common in small-scale fraud cases where the victims would rather recover their money than endure a drawn-out legal fight. Marcus couldn't get me more than that, without crossing lines he wasn't willing to cross, but it was enough. It confirmed something I had begun to suspect but couldn't yet prove. Grant Ashford's lifestyle, the truck for Caleb, the ski trips, the generosity that had made him so magnetic to my son, was not built on the success of an honest business. It was built on quietly defrauding homeowners who trusted him to keep their family safe. I sat on that information for weeks, unsure what to do with it, because knowing something and being able to use it responsibly are very different things, and Priya had warned me repeatedly against doing anything that looked like retaliation or manipulation of my own, since family court judges are notoriously unforgiving toward a parent who appears to be waging war rather than co-parenting. So I waited. I kept showing up for Caleb in whatever small ways he'd allow. I kept my temper on the rare occasions he lashed out at me with comments that had Grant's rhetorical fingerprints all over them. Phrases like, "You never think about anyone but yourself, and some people actually want to be involved." Phrases too polished, too adult, for a boy who had never spoken that way to me before Grant entered our lives. I kept a folder, physical and digital, growing steadily heavier with dates, photographs, screenshots, and a timeline that Priya reviewed with me every few weeks, refining it, making sure it would hold up if it ever needed to. Then came the week before Father's Day, when everything accelerated at a pace I hadn't anticipated. Caleb texted me out of nowhere that he didn't think he wanted to do the Father's Day dinner this year, that he had plans with Grant's family instead, a phrase that landed like a small physical blow. Grant's family, as though I had somehow been quietly reclassified out of the category of family entirely. I didn't argue. I told him I understood that I loved him and that the door was always open if he changed his mind. 2 days later, Renata called me, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since our worst arguments during the divorce, and told me that Caleb had said some things to her that concerned her, that he seemed to believe I had a violent temper, that he'd told her he sometimes felt scared around me. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage while my chest tightened with something between fear and fury, whether she believed that, whether she had ever, in 14 years of marriage and 3 years of co-parenting, seen a single moment of violence from me toward our son. She was quiet for a long moment before saying she didn't know what to believe anymore, which was in some ways worse than if she'd simply accused me outright, because it told me the campaign had reached her too, slowly, the same way it had reached Caleb, one small planted doubt at a time. I called Priya that same night and told her everything, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I heard genuine alarm in her voice. She told me this pattern, a sudden claim of fear or violence appearing out of nowhere with no prior incident report, no prior CPS contact, no prior mention in 3 years of otherwise normal co-parenting, was a classic precursor to what family law professionals sometimes call a manufactured crisis, an event engineered to force an emergency custody modification. She told me to be extremely careful in the coming days, to never be alone with Caleb without some form of documentation if I could help it, doorbell camera, witness anything, and above all, to never, under any circumstances, raise my voice or put my hands on him, even in a benign way, not a shoulder pat, not a hand on the back, nothing that could be reframed later as physical contact. So when Caleb showed up unannounced on Father's Day afternoon, 3 hours before I expected the police, I understood with a kind of eerie clarity that whatever was about to happen had likely already been decided somewhere else, in some conversation I wasn't part of. He came to pick up an old jacket he'd left at my place, he said, and I let him in, and we ended up talking in the kitchen while the ribs cooked, an actual conversation, the first real one we'd had in months, and for about 20 minutes it felt like getting a piece of my son back. He asked about my dad, about the business, about whether I was doing okay since the funeral, and I let myself believe, foolishly and hopefully, that something was thawing. Then his phone buzzed, he glanced at it, his whole posture changed, and 15 minutes later he told me, in a voice that suddenly sounded rehearsed again, that he'd been thinking about it, and he honestly sometimes wished I'd never been his dad, that things would have been easier if Renata had married someone else from the start, someone who was actually around, someone who didn't care more about a broken-down old lot downtown than about him. I felt something crack in my chest, a genuine, unguarded pain that had nothing to do with strategy or documentation, just the raw wound of hearing your own child say something like that to your face. I didn't yell. I didn't move toward him. I said quietly that I was sorry he felt that way, that I loved him no matter what, and that I hoped someday he'd understand things more clearly than he did right now. He looked at me strangely then, almost like he was surprised by his own words, like some part of him hadn't fully believed he'd say them out loud until they were already in the air. Then he walked out the front door, sat on the porch steps, and called 911. I found out later, through the police report Priya obtained during discovery, exactly what he told the dispatcher, that his father had grabbed him by the throat during an argument about money and shoved him into the kitchen wall. Not vague, specific, detailed. The kind of specific, detailed claim that doesn't come from panic, but from preparation. When the officers arrived and spoke to him privately on the porch, they noted in their report that he seemed hesitant, inconsistent on small details, unable to say which wall, unable to explain why there were no marks, no redness, no physical evidence whatsoever of the alleged assault, and unable to look the officers in the eye when describing it. To their credit, the responding officers were thorough and fair. They separated us, took statements independently, checked my hands and his neck for any physical evidence, found none, and ultimately determined there was insufficient evidence to support the claim, though because the accuser was a minor, they were obligated to file a report and notify Child Protective Services regardless, which meant that even without an arrest, I was now facing a formal CPS investigation into my parenting, initiated on the one day of the year designed to celebrate it. I did not fall apart, though I wanted to. Instead, in the days that followed, I did exactly what I had spent the last year preparing to do without fully realizing that's what I was preparing for. I called Priya first thing the next morning and handed her the entire folder, every documented incident, every text screenshot, every note about Grant's comments to Caleb, and the information Marcus had given me about prior fraud complaints against Ashford Secure Systems, which Priya, working entirely within legal boundaries this time through a formal subpoena rather than a favor from a friend, was able to request as part of an expanded discovery motion, arguing that Grant's financial credibility and his documented pattern of coaching or influencing Caleb's statements were directly relevant to the custody matter now in front of the court. The CPS investigator, a measured, experienced woman named Denise Okafor, interviewed Caleb alone, interviewed me, interviewed Renata, interviewed two of Caleb's teachers, and interviewed Caleb's longtime baseball coach, who told her, unprompted, that he'd noticed a real change in Caleb over the past year, that the boy had gone from being warm and easygoing to sullen and anxious, specifically around anything involving his father, a shift the coach said he'd seen before in kids caught in contentious divorces and had always assumed in this case was just normal teenage moodiness until CPS asked him directly. The real unraveling, though, came from a source none of us expected. Caleb himself, 3 weeks after Father's Day, when the weight of what he'd started finally became too heavy for a 17-year-old to carry alone. He called me late on a Tuesday night, his voice small and cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a little boy afraid of thunderstorms, and told me he needed to tell me something, and he needed me to not be mad, though he understood if I was. He told me that Grant had been talking to him for months about how unfair it was that I had all that property from my father while Grant was, in Caleb's words, struggling to keep the business afloat, which was news to me, since I had assumed Grant's finances were healthy given his spending. Grant had told Caleb that if Caleb ever needed to, he could tell people I'd been aggressive with him, that it wouldn't have to be a big lie, just enough to get a judge to reconsider the custody arrangement, and maybe reconsider whether I was a fit trustee for whatever Caleb might eventually inherit, and that this would ultimately help stabilize things for the whole family, a phrase that made my stomach turn when Caleb repeated it, because it was so clearly not his own words, so clearly something coached and rehearsed and repeated until a scared, confused teenager had absorbed it as his own reasoning. Caleb told me he hadn't meant for it to go as far as the actual 911 call, that in the moment, sitting on my porch steps, something in him had just snapped into the script Grant had been feeding him for months, that once he'd said it out loud to the dispatcher, he felt trapped by his own words and didn't know how to take them back. He cried on the phone in a way that told me this wasn't performance. This was a boy finally realizing how thoroughly he'd been used as a tool in someone else's scheme. I told him I loved him, that I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't hurt, because it had more than almost anything in my life, but that I understood how these things work, how a smart, manipulative adult can wear down a kid's judgment over time in ways that aren't the kid's fault. I told him the most important thing he could do now was tell the truth to Denise Okafor and to Priya, on the record, and let the consequences fall where they belonged, which was not on him. What followed was less a dramatic courtroom confrontation than a slow, methodical collapse of Grant's carefully constructed image, which is, I've come to believe, the most realistic and most satisfying kind of justice there is. Caleb's recorded statement to the CPS investigator, combined with the discovery materials Priya had obtained, prompted the state licensing board to reopen the 2 prior fraud complaints against Ashford Secure Systems, and this time with Caleb's account of Grant's financial anxieties corroborating a motive, and with 2 more customers coming forward once the investigation became public in local news, the board didn't let it quietly disappear. Grant was formally charged with multiple counts of consumer fraud for billing over 40 households for monitoring services that were never active, facing not prison exactly. Since prosecutors ultimately negotiated a plea involving restitution, probation, and the permanent revocation of his business license, but a public, thorough, undeniable dismantling of the persona he had spent years building, the generous, successful stepfather who could outprovide the broken-down contractor ex-husband. Renata, for her part, filed for divorce from Grant within a month of learning the full extent of what he'd been doing, both financially and with Caleb telling me later, with a kind of exhausted honesty I respected, that she felt ashamed she hadn't seen it sooner, that his charm had worked on her the same way it had worked on Caleb, just more slowly. The CPS case against me was closed within weeks, marked unfounded, with Denise Okafor's final report explicitly noting that the allegation appeared to have originated from external coaching rather than any genuine incident. Custody wasn't just restored to our prior arrangement. The judge, reviewing the full documented history Priya had assembled over the preceding year, modified the parenting plan to give Caleb the choice to spend more time with me if he wanted, which slowly, cautiously he began to do. I did not gloat. I did not sit Caleb down and make him relive his mistake in detail, because he was carrying enough shame on his own without my help, and because the goal was never to win some private war of humiliation against a 17-year-old who had been failed by an adult who should have protected him instead of using him. The goal, the only goal that ever mattered to me through the entire ordeal, was to get my son back and to make sure the truth eventually stood on its own without needing me to shout it. It's been almost a year now since that Father's Day. Caleb is 18, headed to state college in the fall to study something in engineering, a field he says he got interested in after spending a summer helping me on restoration jobs, learning how buildings get put back together after fire and water damage, which felt like more than a coincidence the first time he said it out loud. We don't pretend the wound from that year fully closed, because some things leave a mark even after they heal, but we talk now, really talk, the kind of conversations we used to have before Grant Ashford ever walked into our lives. Last month, on a random Tuesday with no significance to anyone else, Caleb showed up at my shop unannounced, sat on the same stool his grandfather used to sit on when I was a kid learning the business myself, and told me he was sorry, properly sorry. Not the rushed apology of a scared teenager on the phone, but a slower, more considered one from someone who had spent months thinking it through. He said he understood now what patience actually looked like, that he'd spent a year watching me refuse to fight dirty even when I had every reason to, and that it had taught him more about what kind of man he wanted to be than anything Grant had ever said to him about trucks or inheritances or stability. I told him the truth doesn't usually need help. It just needs time and someone willing to wait for it. This year, Father's Day fell on a warm, ordinary Sunday, and Caleb came over at noon instead of evening, helped me get the grill going, stole a piece of rib meat before it was ready the way he used to when he was small, and told me, without any prompting at all, that he was glad, actually glad, that I was his dad. I didn't say anything back right away. I just let that sit in the air for a while, because some sentences deserve a little silence before you're ready to answer them, and because after everything it had taken to hear him mean it, I wanted to hold on to that moment a little longer before letting it go.